Welcome to Talk South Asian to Me. My name is Michelle.
And my name is Anusha. Tune in every Thursday at 5 p.m. Central and hear us react to each other's stories about mental health and growing up in different South Asian households.
And remember, this podcast is not therapy. Engage with what feels entertaining and resonates with you and leave what doesn't.
Alrighty, let's get into it. Today is
Woohoo!
N.
And
So,
woohoo!
drumroll please. Would you like to reveal what N is today, Michelle?
Yes, our topic is narcissism.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Ooh.
Narcissism and navigating narcissism. All right, so today, to get started with this topic, I thought, like usual, we could kind of break down what exactly does that mean, though. I feel like people pleasing, gaslighting, like narcissism, these are like really like just widely used terms these days to like label people and things. And it's like, are we even using them correctly? So let's just break it down for a moment. Narcissism, as defined by the Oxford Dictionary, is an excessive interest in or admiration of oneself and one's physical appearance.
Yeah.
So,
well, I'm glad
kind
that
of what
you started with that. I'm glad that you started with a definition because, again, you said like it's a big buzzword and it's pretty abstract. So I think it's really important to start. I mean, to be honest, when I was figuring out what story I want to share with you, I had to fully understand the definition myself. So I looked it up as well.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I feel like, what do you think? When you think of narcissism, is that kind of the definition that comes to mind for you too?
I think so. Like just self-centered, you know, like
that's a good word.
Very, very arrogant.
Yeah.
Like those kind of words pop into my head when I hear the word narcissism.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's how people do use it in day to day and like makes sense. That's kind of what the definition is according to Oxford Dictionary. But Mayo Clinic also defines narcissism as a personality qualities, including thinking very highly of yourself, wanting and needing admiration, believing that others are inferior, and lacking empathy for others. So again, kind of along the same like themes of what you were saying, but just kind of expand. Like to me, it felt like it was expanding on that concept a little bit more.
Yeah. The lack of empathy is a big one, I feel like.
Yeah, exactly. And like that feeling of you're superior and everybody else is inferior, I feel like that's a pretty common one too what I associate with narcissism. So I kind of dug into I kind of went on a deep dive with the whole topic of narcissism, and I like really got into it. And I really liked Psych Central, actually. Psych Central had so much. Yeah, it had so much on the topic of like narcissism in general, but also like adult children of like narcissistic parents, and like how do you identify when you're in a relationship, and it's just like so many topics on that, and I thought it was really cool.
Wow. I don't think I've ever heard of Psych Central. I'm gonna have to look that up.
Yeah, Psych Central to me, it kind of is like, you know, the Psychology Today articles that we read sometimes. Psych Central has like a lot of good stuff just like that.
Okay, I'm gonna have to check it out.
So let's talk about what I found out. So in the Psych Central article that started, you know, my rabbit hole, I found that Psych Central categorizes narcissism as existing on a spectrum, which, yeah, that makes sense to me. I see a lot of things on the spectrum too of it's not this or this, it's kind of a range. I get it. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And it further talks about like what that means. So according to Psych Central, if you take accountability, you have insight, you're able to establish reciprocal relationships, and you have some traits of narcissism, you can have traits, not a personality, you know, diagnosis.
It's a difference.
Right? So like, exactly. So that's the thing that they're talking about, this being a spectrum, is like you can have traits of narcissism, but on the other end of the spectrum, you can have like an actual diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. And most people fall somewhere in between, typically, right? You might have one or two traits that come out occasionally. You might have maybe a couple that come out occasionally. most people fall on a spectrum. So I think that's really important to point out because, like we said, it's kind of a buzzword of like, oh, they're just being so narcissistic. And like, what do they
Yeah.
have? Like, they have some kind of, like trying to overdiagnose people. And like, sometimes we just have some moments where maybe we're acting a little bit narcissistic, but that doesn't mean that we are narcissistic. I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah. I like that you pointed that out, that it's two different things.
Yeah. So to kind of talk about the other side of that spectrum, narcissistic personality disorder, basically it's when you have narcissistic traits and behaviors that span over multiple areas of your life for extended period of time. So like 6 months plus.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just for fun, I thought I would just kind of break down like, okay, if you actually qualified for the diagnosis, what was the criteria you needed to meet?
Yeah, I'm interested to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah. So they talk about needing to meet 5 of the 9 symptoms that I'll list out in a moment and having those symptoms for at least 6 months or more in order to qualify it for this diagnosis.
Okay.
Okay, so here it goes. The particular symptoms are grandiosity or, like a sense of self-importance.
Okay.
Fantasizing about power and success. A sense of entitlement. Limited insight. A constant need for admiration and praise. The use of manipulation tactics to take advantage of others. Limited or poor empathy. Competitiveness, distrust, and jealousy. And the last one is scorn and arrogance towards others.
Wow.
Yeah. Makes sense, right?
You have to
like
meet
when you think
5
about
of
it.
the 9 that you listed.
Yeah.
For 6 months or more.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
If you meet 5 of these 9 symptoms for at least 6 months or more, then you would qualify for this diagnosis. Otherwise, you fall somewhere on that spectrum of you might have characteristics, you might have traits. But either way, it's just a label at the end of the day, and it doesn't take away from your experience. Whether you have the diagnosis or not, whether you're dealing with a person who has diagnosis or not, it doesn't mean that it's still not, a struggle or like that experience isn't as bad or, like whatever comparisons don't need to be made.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So as I was doing this research on like particularly narcissism in the South Asian community, I ran across this article, this podcast. So, Jay Shetty's podcast On Purpose?
Yes. Yes.
So he had a guest speaker, Dr. Ramani, who's a psychologist in LA, and she's the author of Should I Stay or Should I Go? Surviving a Relationship with a Narcissist. And the guest star on this, she's kind of like almost like an expert on narcissism, particularly in like South Asian community. She's South Asian. So something that really stood out to me in the podcast of what she said was the word narcissist is overused nowadays. Too many people refer to those who do them wrong as a narcissist, which may or may not actually be true. The article goes on to say that Dr. Ramani told Jay Shetty that this personality type would never be prominent. We would love for them to be like the cartoon villain, mean, lying, deceitful. It would make it easier to avoid them if we saw through them from the beginning. And this is more me paraphrasing, but like the rest of the article goes on to like basically say like an actual narcissist would be so good at being like two-faced, like to everybody else being like so charismatic and like so sweet and so loving that you'd never really see them as a narcissist, even if they were. Like they're so good with the manipulation that you'd never know.
Wow.
And so she basically is trying to point that out of like, sometimes we just throw these words out, but maybe people are just in moments embodying narcissistic traits. That doesn't mean they are a bad guy or the narcissist. So I thought it was kind of cool to highlight that.
That is interesting. Yeah. I never thought of it that way either. Like it's not as prominent or it's not as exhibiting to a person who might be in a relationship with that narcissistic person.
Yeah. So. Especially I think in the beginning, but like once you're in a relationship, I think you'd see that more. Like gaslighting behaviors, things like that. And for all the like parents who are on, that end of that spectrum of having a diagnosis or just have a lot of traits, like even for them, like you might see as a child one of their faces being narcissistic, but to everybody else, like they're
Yeah.
not going to see that. Maybe they see the best of them, right? And so like I think that's the
Yeah.
point she's trying to make, is like you never know, and like sometimes it's not as obvious, sometimes it is.
Yeah. That makes
um
sense.
yeah, so I was kind of in my deep dive, I kind of looked into like what are the different kinds of ways that, you know, if it's not obvious, like how would you be able to tell, what would it look like? And so
Mhm.
some of
Mhm.
the manipulation tactics that a narcissistic person might use is gaslighting, right? So it's not
Mhm.
necessarily lying, but lying so much that they kind of make you think you're going crazy, you know, calling you
Yeah.
out, not just saying like, oh no, there's no facts for that, but also saying like, you don't remember correctly, you're absolutely wrong, you're going crazy, why are you doing this to me? You know, like flipping it on themselves, playing the victim card, you know, that's one too.
Yes.
This one actually surprised me, but it makes sense now. Love bombing. Are you familiar with that term?
Oh, love bombing. Yeah. Like I feel like I've heard that where you like the person who is doing the love bombing is the one who's like falling very like quickly, like, oh, I've known you forever, I feel like I've known you
Yes,
forever, saying I love you right
exactly.
away, like all those different things.
Yeah, like when there's really like you will feel it too, like a little bit of like, oh, okay, like what? Because you might only know that person
Mm-hmm.
really for a week, but then you're getting
Yeah.
like all of these like, wow, like I really know you so well, and I love you so much, and it's like, what do you love? You know me about a week only, you know, and like all the maybe like gifts or praises or like whatever, just
Yeah.
like all at once, this attack of love. It's also like a manipulation tactic
Mm.
to, because the way I see it, this is all kind of like around the idea of control, right? You control the people in your relationships through
Mm-hmm.
gaslighting, through love bombing. Some of the other ones they mention is like ghosting can even be one. And I that caught me off guard for a second because I was like, ghosting, huh? But I
Mm.
think the
That's a
context
tactic,
it was
ghosting.
saying, yeah, I know that I was confused too, but then I thought about it, and I guess like if you think about it, it can be a tactic, right? Like
Okay.
if you
How?
hurt my, like if I expect something from you but you don't do that thing, then I can purposefully
uh
ghost you for a while
like
and I get
silent
you back on
treatment.
my hook. Yeah,
Yeah, like
exactly.
silent treatment. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
and then make you
manipulative.
be
I
like,
don't like
okay, I'm
silent treatment.
sorry. Yeah.
Silent treatment is like, I hate it so much.
Mm.
Like, just say
It's
you need space, right?
I know. Yeah. I hate when it's used as like a tactic because it does make you feel
Yeah.
so like shitty.
Yeah.
But being, you know, like I've done a couple therapies, so like I see the flip side of it, and like sometimes it's because people are so like overwhelmed that they don't even
Oh,
know
yeah,
like
for sure.
to say like, hey, I need space. All they can do is
Like,
just shut down.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
you know,
That
like it's
makes
still
sense.
hurtful on the other side of it.
Yeah. Well, it's like the
Um,
extreme end, right? Like when you're using silent
yeah,
treatment for a really long time. When
to
you,
manipulate too on
yeah,
purpose
yeah.
to get your way.
Mm
Yeah,
hmm. Mm hmm.
absolutely. Other manipulation things, triangulation, so like involving another person
Oh, yes.
into this, you
Yeah.
know, into the dynamic to like either try and defend or gang up on you, right? So
Mm.
there's that, playing the victim, like I said. And this one was a little bit like, whoa, that's extreme. Revenge, apparently.
Oh,
Revenge is
revenge.
considered a manipulation tactic that narcissists could use.
Mm.
That seems scary, but if we're talking about a spectrum, I imagine that would be on the very one
Yeah.
end of the
Very
spectrum.
extreme and
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
So to clarify, you know, again, you can have all of these like different traits that we're going to talk about in a minute about like what maybe like in South Asian culture, like what do people do that can be
Yeah.
narcissistic? But
Yeah.
I want to clarify again, that doesn't mean somebody has narcissistic personality diagnosis or they are narcissistic. It could just be that they're engaging in narcissistic behaviors from time to time. Because I
Okay.
think once we start talking about it, I think you'll see like what I mean. Some of these things are just so commonly just like thrown out there. And like
Yeah.
I had to take a double take. I was like, oh, is that narcissistic? And I thought about it. I was like, oh, yeah, I guess it is. But at first glance, it
Yeah.
just feels so normalized. And I think in the South Asian culture,
Yeah.
especially, it's just so embedded that you don't even like
Yes.
sometimes realize that.
Yeah.
Particularly because I think that in our like South Asian and like just East Asian culture, we do have such an emphasis on like respect your elders and like be
Mm-hmm.
obedient, be loyal.
Mm-hmm.
It's very like, if you remember parenting styles, right? It's very authoritarian. Fall into
Yes.
line, do as I say. So I think that kind of parenting style and this like respect your elders, that like really, really huge value tenant, it kind of
Mm-hmm.
paves the way for narcissistic traits to just really thrive in parents,
Yes. And it
right?
can be reinforced too
Yeah.
in those
Yeah,
types of
that one
households.
is yeah, and that's just so like crazy to think about. Like the system itself is set up in a way that it really caters to
Mm-hmm.
narcissistic manipulation and behaviors. And
Yeah.
I had to sit with that for a second and be like, wow, that's crazy, but it's so true.
Yeah.
It
It
starts
is
all the way at
true.
the top.
And it's a cycle
Mm-hmm.
because it's
Okay.
so normalized, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's two other articles I want to share real fast. One of them is from
Yeah.
Times of India, and it's
Okay.
titled, Do You Have Narcissistic Parents? Here's How to Know.
That's a good
That
title.
one, it's amazing. I was like, wow, look at Times of India coming in, really like coming after parents. Okay.
Yeah.
Here's what Times of India had to say. Some of the things they came up with were one, that parents live through their children's lives.
Okay.
So basically, like expectations for their kids, like you can be one of these three careers. You can marry like one of
Mm.
these people that I choose for you, just like making
Yeah.
major life decisions for them. Another thing they mentioned on the article was being jealous and possessive, parents feeling like
Mm.
entitled to their kid's life, feeling threatened by their child's growth, their maturity, or they're individualizing, if they have
Yeah.
different opinions, different expectations, that really being something that shakes them up and like they don't like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that also kind of makes me think of like that competitiveness, like
Yeah.
trying to compete with your kid. And it's, because it's about you, it's not about your kid, right? There's not that
Yeah.
separation. Um, Another example they came up with was over criticizing and putting the child down, making them feel like they're never good enough.
Mm.
Um, Basically that, right there, that's the birth of people pleasing tendencies, right? Never feeling
Yeah.
good enough. So you try your best to keep pleasing, to keep avoiding conflict, to be the peacekeeper, all of that.
Yeah.
Another thing was having a superior self image. So having like that superiority over others and treating others as objects for their personal gain, their
Mm-hmm.
priorities, their needs, their expectations being more important than their kids' needs, priorities, and expectations.
Mm.
Um, this one, definitely manipulation, right? We've already talked about that. Showing like very conditional love,
Yeah.
gaslighting, threatening, using guilt, using shame to get your way, being inflexible, very like my way or the highway.
Yeah.
Um, and then the last one was just like lacking empathy, love, and compassion for your child. Not
Yeah.
feeling understood, I
Those are
guess,
harsh.
is how I read it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And exactly what you said, right? These seem a little bit like on the harsher end. But
Yeah.
again, this is a spectrum, right? So it doesn't have to be like
Yeah.
all of them, and it doesn't have to be like to a very like harsh
Mm-hmm.
degree of it. But this is Times of India's opinion. It's one of them.
Yes. Yes. No, but
um,
I mean, it's real, right?
mhm.
Like,
It
I'm sitting
is.
here listening to all these characteristics that
Mm-hmm.
can be displayed in narcissistic parents, especially in
Mm-hmm.
South Asian households. And
Yeah.
it's just eye opening too. Like, oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yep, I've seen that, or I've seen
Mm-hmm.
this. And then it's also like the harsh
Yeah.
reality too, unfortunately.
Yeah. Absolutely. I can't wait to share my story with you later.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear.
Um, Going back to that last article that I want to talk about real fast. This one was the 5 common struggles of adult children of narcissistic parents
Okay.
by Psych Central. I'm
Okay.
telling you, Psych Central was just coming in real clutch.
Mm. Okay,
And
okay, okay,
here's
Psych
what Psych
Central.
Central. I know, go
Okay.
Psych Central. Here's what it had to say. One, people pleasing. Right? That makes sense. The way I interpreted it in particular was because you don't follow the expectations of a parent that might be narcissistic, then that means you might have grown up witnessing their like volatile like rage or like just being super upset because they don't know how to regulate what's happening, this dissonance of like, you have a different expectation than my expectation, why aren't you meeting this? And so that
Yeah.
like use of rage or guilt or shame or like something to manipulate would, like I said earlier, pave the way to create these like people pleasing tendencies, right? The other, again, like I said earlier, is like avoiding conflict and trying to survive by. Obviously, if you're in an environment where you never know like what's going to trigger somebody and like it's a really like big outburst, you're going to learn, nobody wants to like deal with that. So you're going to learn to like avoid conflict. You're going to learn how to be a peacekeeper. You're going to learn how to like read people's situations and like kind of take distance from it, right? So that you don't have to get into those situations again and again. Another one that they talked about was persistent self-doubt. Like when we talk about like manipulation and like gaslighting, we talk about the idea of you're basically questioning your reality. And if you've always been questioned, your reality has been questioned, you're learning that you need to second guess yourself because you're learning you can't trust your intuition, you can't trust your instincts, you can't trust your truth because that's what everybody is like questioning. So then you don't trust yourself, you get disconnected from that part of you, and you have a lot of self-doubt, you can't make decisions, things like that. Usually I will say like people like that too, we consider them like hyper vigilant people, right? Because they get so good at recognizing when somebody is about like sudden shifts in like maybe mood or like facial expressions. Like you get so
Picking
good
up
at
on
reading.
cues.
Yeah, you're so hyper vigilant to these cues. It can be considered a superpower, but that's a good and bad thing. Like, yeah, okay, great. You're so intuitive in other people, not yourself. But it's a bad thing because it's coming from a traumatic place. It's a trauma response to be able to do that,
It is a
because it's
trauma
all about
response.
protecting you.
Yeah.
If you know when someone's about to shift, you know how to keep yourself safe. You need to keep yourself safe, right? So it's really sad trauma response, but it can also be like considered, I guess, a superpower.
Yeah.
Being able to tell.
Yeah.
Another common struggle of adult children with narcissistic parents is, let's see, feeling like guilt, shame, or fear about succeeding or being in the spotlight. The idea of basically not being good enough and like constantly being criticized makes you want to maybe like shrink away from like that critical eye of like, how's your work? Are you successful? Are you not? If you're constantly receiving that criticism, you want to shrink away from that. You feel a lot of guilt, shame, a lot of maybe even self-sabotaging because you don't want to deal with that. Or even, perfectionist tendencies, maybe going the other way on that. The other thing that it mentioned too was like how it shows up in relationships as insecure or anxious attachment styles, basically showing up from parent to partner. Like in the first podcast, remember we talked about parents to partners. What's the attachment style? It talks about how if you grow up with this kind of narcissistic parenting, you might seek out partners inherently who are abusive, manipulative, who might repeat some of the narcissistic patterns that your parents repeated. And that might make you feel like this intense sense of fear of abandonment, or it might make you really dependent or even emotionally unavailable in relationships. And with all of that, it will certainly perpetuate this feeling of like unworthiness and unlovableness.
Wow. I feel like you like summarized so many different aspects of topics that we've already talked about in such a beautiful way, but like also in such a cohesive way, and really shows us that things are intertwined and everything's not black and white. Like, people pleasing, the attachment styles, the parenting styles, parent characteristics, and all of it is tied together. It's interesting.
Yeah. And it's all in the gray of that spectrum, all messy.
Yeah.
Nothing is clean cut.
Exactly.
Now, I feel like I just threw a bunch of this information, like very heavy, like very icky. So I just want to take a quick pause and like talk about, like, this is not something that nothing can be done about, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
granted, like when somebody genuinely has narcissistic personality diagnosis, then yes, they typically are unable to recognize a need for change. So they might not change. Okay, fair enough. That might be true. That's not within your control. But you do have things within your control to heal from being parented by a narcissist.
Yes. Yes.
And that definitely therapy can help with that, learning how to heal from those kinds of wounds, learning how to reparent yourself, healing that inner child version of you that went through that. And then in the present tense, a lot of clients or a lot of people who have narcissistic parents, or even parents who, for example, have like borderline disorder, just like diagnoses basically, that affect their relationships. Some people choose to cut off parents, but not everybody does. And I think it's important to like acknowledge and recognize that there's no one right way to do this. It's based on your situation. And like, you can heal and you can learn what you need that works for you, whether that's to cut off the parent or whether that's to find some middle ground where you can protect yourself, but you can still engage in some kind of relationship.
Yeah.
So a little message of hope. It's not all doom and gloom.
Yeah. It's not. I agree. And I'm excited to share my story because it dips into that a little bit.
Good. Yeah, I can't wait to hear it then.
Yeah.
Okay, so then I want to just share real quick, in particular, narcissism in like South Asians, like really concentrating on like the South Asian population for a moment.
Okay.
This is how I did a little bit of a TikTok deep dive this time, and I looked up like narcissism in South Asians, and I just wanted to see like what the general population, what are people talking about?
Yeah.
And this is kind of the stuff that I got from like random videos on TikTok. This was people's experiences. One, people who had narcissistic parents, South Asian parents, felt like they were never allowed to have boundaries or opinions outside of what their parents expected. Totally makes sense. We've already kind of talked about that.
Yeah.
Another person talked about like growing up thinking of like someone else was just such a big thing that you're so attuned to others in your life now, as like in a career setting and like a relationship setting, continuing to be that way in a family setting and even like a friendship setting, just being so attuned to somebody else and their needs that it's like really difficult to like receive compliments, receive gifts. It's difficult to receive anything from somebody else because you're so used to giving.
Yes.
That one really resonated. I feel like that's very common
like,
for a lot of people.
Ding. Yeah.
I saw that in your face. You're like, And then someone else talked about like having a really hard time distinguishing between what they wanted versus what their parents wanted. Because, often you're given that like maybe like guilt trip of like, well, I am doing this for you. Like, this is for your benefit. Like, I know what's best for you. And so you kind of like almost self-doubt, right? Of, okay, maybe I don't want this. Maybe I should do this.
Yeah.
That's a big thing, I think. And then something we talked about earlier, being conflict averse. This person talked about like always being the peacekeeper, really just shrinking away from any and all conflict, never wanting to engage with that. I get a lot of clients like that, and it's like huge reparenting, huge unlearning of conflict isn't bad, but it's how we conflict that matters.
Exactly. Conflict is inevitable.
Yeah.
It's how we deal with it and react to it.
Yeah, and we need it. We need conflict.
Yeah,
We're going to have conflict because we're all so different as people, but it's how we fight that matters. That makes the difference between, a quote unquote good fight and a bad fight,
Yeah.
So right about now I had this like almost like epiphany of like, it's narcissist like behaviors and like people who have narcissistic tendencies, like it's all about control. Like that's kind of my little aha moment as I was going through all of these videos and like all these articles. I was thinking like, this is just, it all really comes down to that. It's all about control.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Control and power. And anyways, back to this. So other things that I saw people talk about was denying like reality of what happened, right? So again, like a form of gaslighting.
Yeah.
Mom, like, remember that one time when this happened? And like just flat outright, like, no, that never happened. I don't remember that. That didn't happen, no.
Yeah.
Not taking accountability or responsibility for what happened, an extension of that. And this one hit like a lot. Not having the ability to self-reflect, doesn't see anything wrong in their action, only sees your faults in their behavior and action and reaction, and will portray themselves as the victim. Like using health, for example, of like, I'm like really old and like my health is bad and you know that. And like, how can you say that? You know, just basically like when you're in the middle of something and you're talking about something, like quickly turning it back on like victim mentality, like, but woe is me. Like, how can you say that about me? Like, I'm, you know, struggling or whatnot.
Yeah.
Deflecting that blame basically and like turning it around, especially when they know they're about to, again, lose control over that argument or that point. Yeah. So other than that, what I spent some time doing too was like thinking about like, okay, so like what are the things that people actually say? What are the things that we hear that could be considered coming from a very narcissistic place? And these were some of the things, again, that I got from lots of different sources of what people often hear.
Okay.
Mostly from South Asian parents, but also just like a
general
kind of a hodgepodge of places.
Okay.
Here it goes. You ready?
Yes.
I'm going to look at you after everyone to see how you react.
Okay, I'm ready.
The first one was, you'll regret this one day when I'm gone. I know.
Not surprised with that
death
one.
Card.
Yeah. Yeah.
After everything I did for you, this is how you repay me. Ooh, and this one's a doozy. You think that's abuse? You should have seen my childhood growing up. The comparison.
I feel like I've heard variations of that too. Like you don't know what I dealt with growing up.
Yeah. Like,
so
you think this is hard? You should have seen how I had to do X, Y, Z. Yeah. And then just like flat out, right, just being like, well, my needs are more important than your needs, or what I want is more important than what you want. And then this one, you know, lo kya kahenge, right? Basically, the public image is important, and so anything to protect that image. And this isn't so much of a thing maybe that people hear, but I think this really stood out to me in one video. This one woman talks about how like her narcissistic mom was very like transactional in her love, and like when she met her mom's needs, there would be a lot of praise. When she met her mom's expectations, there would be a lot of praise. But when she didn't meet her mom's needs, didn't meet her expectations, the mom would like withhold her love and like criticize and be disappointed and use that disappointment to like shame and guilt her into doing what she wanted.
Like silent treatment.
And I think that like one piece right there like really gives a good idea, in my opinion, of what like it's like to have a narcissistic parent right there.
Yeah.
Because it's about them, and it's about how they can use manipulation to control you. Like those are the two big pieces of that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a lot of story time. I think we're ready for personal story.
Okay. I'm ready to hear your story.
Here goes. So my story is basically, I felt like growing up, as I was reflecting on all of these like research articles and like this, like I said, I never knew that I had any dealings in my experience with anybody who was narcissistic. Like I was like, oh, what? Really? But as I was learning about this and reflecting on it, I realized that my mom had some traits occasionally that would come out in the way she said things. For example, she would say sometimes like, I know you better than you know yourself. And like, okay, she's a mom. Most of the time she's not wrong, but sometimes she is wrong, you know? Like, for example, when she wanted me to, I don't know, like pursue medicine, when she wanted me to pursue certain hobbies, you know, extracurriculars and stuff, she'd be like, I know you better than you yourself. If you just push yourself to do this, I know you're going to be okay with it. to be fair, that's how I usually was. I
Yeah.
had to be pushed into activities to do them, and then sometimes I liked them, sometimes I didn't.
Yeah.
But like, you know, right there, like there's that
This is
separation of
different.
like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, there's that separation of like, I'm an extension of her,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so like that theme kind of continues on, you know, for example, when I was in like college and like she wanted me to major in one thing, I wanted to major in another thing. I tried to do her major, spectacularly flunked out, and then did what I wanted to do. Worked out, but
Yeah.
you know, again, it's coming from that idea of like she knows me and she wants me to kind of follow her expectations, and like we had a lot of
Yeah.
like conversations and like arguments, and like I was like, all right, fine, I'll try it. Didn't work out. Put my foot down.
Yeah.
But that's when it started to get like even worse, because in college I had the space, I had like some independence and freedom to explore the independence, freedom to explore my values, my interests. And so
Mm-hmm.
something I heard a lot in college was, you used to be so sweet and you listened to me all the time. You've changed.
Oh. Oh, you've
I know.
changed.
You've
Interesting.
changed. And like, she's not wrong. I did change.
Yeah.
But what she's basically saying, right, is you now have your own like mind. You do what you want to do, and you're not caring as much when I kind of pout about.
Yeah.
It's not sometimes making a difference, right? And so she didn't know what to
Yeah.
do with that. She was like, I don't like, what is this new Anusha who's not listening to what I want, who I can't, I mean, it sounds harsh to say, but I can't manipulate out of your choices, you
Yeah.
know? And it's not like she was doing it on purpose, but she was also intentionally trying to change my views, right?
Yeah.
Um, so like that's an example. And at the time, and like even now, like I don't see it as coming from a bad place, but it's an example of how you can portray traits of narcissism without being
Yeah.
narcissistic. I think these are really
Yeah.
good examples of that.
There.
Um, and to me, like the way that I read these examples of narcissistic behaviors is that they're backed by the fear of the unknown. It's not coming from a place
Mm.
necessarily of, she thinks she's better than me. She thinks she's trying to, you know, control somebody inferior. Rather, she's afraid of the unknown because she cares and she doesn't know what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
So,
that makes
again, I
sense.
think that's a really big piece of distinguishing between having narcissistic traits versus having that narcissistic personality disorder. I think that's the big
Yeah.
piece there of what that
Yeah.
distinguishing factor is.
Yeah.
And then after college, you know, once I was in my like therapy track and, you know, going through the courses of grad school and becoming a therapist and all of that, I started like in my own therapy too. And like I was starting to learn um, like assertively communicating, for example. Started to learn how some things were okay and not okay in the past, and like what can I do about it now? Like, you know, all of that stuff, right? So I was having conversations with mom about like the things I learned, and like she completely brought this on herself, by the way. She asked me, was there anything I've done that was like that?
Oh.
Obviously, I was like, well, I guess. And so I was thinking about it, and I was telling her like maybe what she did that like didn't feel
Yeah.
good, or like she maybe shouldn't have done. And so she
Yeah.
goes, "Oh, well, I guess I'm just a bad parent then. Is that what you're saying?" Kind of
Mm.
make, you know, that victim card. Like she didn't know
Yeah.
how to, she didn't expect that, and it like really shook her for a moment, that she
Yeah.
immediately like got defensive and like
Mm-hmm.
played the victim card of like, okay, well, fine, I guess I'm the bad parent then.
Yeah. No, that's something that I resonate with too. I've heard that
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, like making it about them when
Mm-hmm.
it was like, well, it's about the issue. And like you can have done
Mm-hmm.
wrong things, bad things, and not
Yeah.
be a bad person. But sometimes that separation can get lost.
Yeah.
Of like, yeah.
Exactly.
Um, but luckily, you know, now and then very different. Like mom, as I said, she doesn't have like, she's not on the other end of the spectrum. She's very much on this end of the spectrum. Very like couple of sprinkle little things
Yeah.
she says or believes. They're very thought based. So for me, it was being able to like communicate in a way that she understood, and like doing it enough, trying to get past that barrier of like, mom, I'm not calling you a bad person. I'm saying
Yeah.
you've made some not so great choices, and like really kind of reiterating that and like showing that. And she was receptive to receiving it. Like willing and able
Okay.
to like challenge her thoughts, willing and able to like change her thoughts.
That's
So I
good.
haven't heard those things from her.
Look at
Now.
that. You're breaking
Yeah, I have not
cycles,
heard
ma'am. Look at you. I'm
that.
so proud of
True,
you.
true.
I'm so proud
And
of you.
I think our relationship is like that much better for it because,
Wow.
there's just no place with guilt and shame to have a really strong relationship. And like, I'm not saying my mom's perfect. Like, will she sometimes still try to trip me up and be like, well, I'm doing this because I love you. Like, just take my love and like try to still
Yeah.
guilt me sometimes? Sure. Will she still pout when I refuse to wear clothes she wants me to wear and not clothes I want to wear? Sure. But the difference is like, I have that boundary of like, no, I'm not going to do it though. I love you. Little
Yeah.
kiss. Okay, bye. I'm leaving. Like
Yeah.
having that ability no longer like derails her into being, wow, you're being so bad, or like, oh, I'm such a bad parent. I can't believe I didn't teach you
Mm-hmm.
to be respectful of what I wanted. Like that's not there.
Mm-hmm.
But before we got to that place, of course, there was some struggle around like, I mean, I'm sure you remember I had a lot of people pleasing tendencies as we,
Mm-hmm.
South Asian women tend to have. And I definitely had that earlier, what I said, that superpower of being able to like recognize when situations, people's emotions like shift and change, like being able to recognize that and read the room. For a really long time, I was the peacekeeper
Yeah.
because I was praised for being, a good, obedient girl who
Mm-hmm.
listened. So I did
Yeah.
keep it up for a really long time. Um, but often that did mean that I was battling like feelings of not being good enough and like feeling this like disconnect between what I wanted and what I did to keep the peace. And that really took a toll on my self-confidence, my
Mm-hmm.
self-worth. As we talked about a lot, like that really took a toll on all of that repressed anger that I had. And I had to learn
Yeah. Yeah.
how to feel that anger, how to use that anger and like be able to communicate so that anger wouldn't keep building up anymore.
Wow.
But yeah, that's kind of my story. And like when I was reflecting on like narcissism and like how that can look in families, that this is kind of what I remembered that really stood out to me. And I'm glad that my experience has given me that appreciation of like the spectrum is very real. Not
Yes.
everyone falls on one end or the other. It can be very, very
Mm-hmm.
different person to person, which means that each solution for each of these, moments when you might be with a narcissistic person, it can be very different and it can be very to what is actually right for you. And nobody can tell you
Yeah.
that's right or wrong.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So that's my story.
Wow. No, kudos to you for, being so self-aware, doing that self-work and,
Mm,
working on your healing and feeling it's so courageous for you to speak up
mm,
and share with your mom, like, when she asked you that question, like for
yeah.
feedback and
Thank
really
you.
not letting that victimization get to you and help like create senses
Yeah.
of guilt and shame. Like you were
Yeah.
able to redirect her and kind of bring her back and be like, I'm not calling you a
Yeah.
bad person. I'm
Yeah.
just sharing like, about the choices that you made. I love that. I loved how you
Yeah.
phrased that. And I loved how you were able to speak your truth and your experience in a
Mm,
way that she was receptive to. And it was
yeah.
that's
And
really
I
amazing.
don't want it to be misconstrued as like, wow, like I did therapy and like boom, like I knew how to do this. Not
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
really messy, like icky process getting to that
Mm-hmm.
place of being able to effectively communicate it. And it took a while. So
Yeah.
I'm kind of like speeding through that process to share what
Yeah.
like worked well, but
Yeah.
definitely like I would definitely get guilted. I would get shamed for a little bit and like I would retreat away sometimes. Sometimes when I tried, I'd be like bawling my eyes out trying to
Yeah.
communicate.
No,
So
it's
it's
not
definitely
easy.
not perfect
Yeah.
and it's not
Yeah.
easy. Exactly.
Yeah. I understand that too. Like it's not an overnight thing. Like, it takes
Yeah.
work, it takes courage, it takes
Mm.
persistence. So kudos to
Yeah.
you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I want to hear all about your story now.
Okay. So, no, I feel like I learned so much from you. And I feel like it kind
Mm.
of brings a little bit more oomph to my story. I feel like I can add a
I
little
love
bit
it.
more to it or give you a little bit more context with what we talked about.
Mm.
So, kind of, again, we talked about this in the beginning when you were defining narcissism, right? It's something that's very normalized in South Asian, some South Asian households. Definitely is normalized and was normalized growing up too in the environment I grew up in. And again, right, the words that really scream at me and resonate with my experiences are like the arrogance, the sense of self-importance, entitlement. And again, we talked about this too earlier in this episode, that it plays a huge role in how I was taught to treat elders. And like that they're the most important, they can never be wrong. Right. Any form of protest or ideas that goes against their own ideas, is an attack and completely wrong. So again, I wanted to preface this story that I'm going to share again, right? Like, I'm not a licensed professional that can like diagnose or anything. And like we mentioned, it's a spectrum. And so I'm just going to share about like my experience and the traits that I picked up in my household. So my relationship with my dad hasn't been like a straight line. It's been rocky, like growing up. I like have very, very amazing memories with my dad. He like would always empower us and like joining in household chores and like getting us what we want. He would spoil us, take us to the store. Like if we're going to the grocery store, like Walmart, he would take us to the toy section and tell us to pick out one toy, you know, like it was very, very sweet and loving. And he would dedicate his time to take us to the park, do weekend outings like the zoo. Or my favorite at all time memory is that we would do this very routinely, is like go and feed the ducks. There's like this lake. There's this lake actually by our house, not too far. And we would go like maybe every Sunday and take bread. And I know that's not healthy to do. I recognize that now. But it was sweet because right. It was sweet.
It's okay.
Yeah. The ducks enjoyed it in the moment, right? But it was really sweet. And I really cherished that memory. Like it was just me and my sister and my dad sometimes, or just me and my dad. And we would just sit and enjoy nature, hear the birds, feed the ducks, and just relax. And I don't know, like certain age or certain time throughout my childhood, I want to say like high school time around, there was like a shift a little bit in the relationship that we shared, especially emotionally. Like he definitely like showed his love through like lots of, you know, support, making sure like not really saying no if I asked or requested things, right? Like he was very, very supportive in that way. But when it came to like being emotionally available and that quality time, there was a shift that I felt. And that kind of took like, especially me and my sister, it took a little toll on us. Like, oh, like, you know, we missed that dad that would spend time with us a lot. And there was one day me and my sister were reflecting, and this is actually very recently, not too many years back, but a couple years back. My sister and I was like, okay, maybe like it's worth a try to have like a sit down conversation with him and understand what's going on, and maybe like share what our thoughts and feelings are. We like reflected on love languages, and we're like, maybe like his love language is different now, or it's shifted or changed, and ours is different. And so we sat down with him one time, like after dinner, and we calmly like shared our thoughts and feelings. He was calm. We calmly requested that we would appreciate more quality time with him. And we like explained love languages to him in a way that he would understand, and explain to like, you know, like you cut fruit for us, you take care of our necessities, you make sure like, you know, our needs are met, our requests are met. And that's like your way of showing love. But we also want you like, you know, your presence and like your time. That would like, that's something that's important to us. And of course, and mind you, like my dad, like even when we were younger and like through this time too, like the emotional availability wasn't like quite always there. Like the quality time was there growing up. But when it came to like talking about emotions and confronting emotions, that was more I shared with my mom and not my dad. So he wouldn't be the one that we would expect to get super emotional. And so when we were having this conversation and, you know, sitting down and talking about this, he turned the conversation into how much he has done for the family and how he feels that no one appreciates him. He actually did get emotional, which was very surprising to us. And in a way, like reflecting back, that's good, right? Like he's showing emotions, he's being real, he's, you know, that's important. But it also made us feel guilty in the moment, and it felt
Right.
like, we felt bad in the moment that, oh, we made him feel like this. And so, of course, we validated him in the moment, and that we told him that we do appreciate him and what he has done for us. But we were also in a place similar to like you, right? Like, we did redirect him, and we told him, like, we're not saying that he's not a good dad. We know how much he's done for us, but this is what's important. This emotional need is still important to us. And he was receptive. Like, he was like, yeah, like, okay, like, I'll try my best for that. But I think there was still like a disconnect because, again, I think he was really, in that conversation, it just became really about himself. And I think someone who is so engrossed in that state has a hard time taking perspective of other people and relating to their emotional needs, like we talked about, right? There's no perspective taking, there's lack of empathy. So even in this conversation, like, there wasn't any empathy that was being shown. And so as much as, like, like, that's kind of something that me and my sister still talk about, is like, where is that disconnect and why is that there? And I think that's when those traits, those qualities can come out in those moments, right? When you do try to push those buttons about emotional needs and emotional availability, like, oh, like, no, I can't do that because I don't know how to, / I wasn't taught how to. And so this is how I know control, and I'm going to control the situation by making it about myself. And that's what happened in this situation. And I would say, like, these traits and qualities were showcased, like, in both my parents, and the comments that you were sharing about parents, like the types of comments that parents have shared about when showcasing these traits, definitely resonate, definitely heard of that. But I think when you shared the common struggles of adult children of narcissistic, like, parents, or parents that showcase those narcissistic qualities, I was like, wow, like, check, 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 like, literally every single one of them. And I think it goes back to, like, the experience too, like, there was just so much going on in my childhood with my sister's illness and everything. Like, those narcissistic qualities were coming out in different ways. And then it was causing those struggles that we talked about. So, like, the self-doubt, definitely, struggle with that. People pleasing, hypervigilance is a big one for me, because I basically have a whole career out of it, if you think about it. I actually talked about this with my therapist, that, like, my work being a child life specialist, helping patients and families cope with their medical experience, like, I have to be hyper vigilant in my work and look for those cues, look for those changes in facial expressions, and then intervene, right? Like, provide my, like, interventions, whether that's distraction or education or whatever, like verbal cues to support in decreasing that stress. So I'm like, it's, in a way, like, this is a trauma response, turned it into, like, a skill set that is a career that's being reinforced. And so now, like, I'm working on, like, how to separate, work-related hypervigilance. I can't even speak right now. Hypervigilant. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, you are. It's just a tongue twister a little bit, I know.
But, like, how to separate work and personal life, and not blending that, because it is a trauma response for me. And, like, I think I've talked about this in previous. What were you saying? Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, like, although I understand that, like, even I agree with you, like, it is definitely a trauma response, and, like, obviously we don't want to be so hyper vigilant that we're constantly feeling that lack of safety in our bodies, and, like, trying to, like, constantly be aware so that we can feel safe. But I think that once you can heal and you're on the other side of that healed side of hypervigilance, I think we don't lose our ability to be observational, but we can get rid of and shed, like, the hypervigilance of, like, feeling unsafe and needing it, without having to, like, shed this, adaptive, cool skill of being able to actually be aware and, like, perceptive and, like, intuitive. And
no, I agree.
I think it can still be your superpower.
No,
without
no,
having
I'm
to feel
grateful.
unsafe.
Yeah, like, like, sometimes, like, the best qualities that we share are sometimes comes from, trauma response. And I think, in order for, I'm still working on those, struggles like people pleasing, hypervigilance, self-doubt, shame, guilt, right? All of those, recovering from that. But I think like what you said, feeling that you're so hypervigilant that you're feeling
Yeah.
like, oh, you don't have safety, emotional
Yeah.
safety, or, whatever you're feeling because of that moment. And I feel like that does trickle like that. I don't feel like that in the moment at work, but like, that does
Mm.
carry over in my personal life. And that I'm constantly worrying of fear of abandonment, right? Like, oh, like if I say
Yeah.
this friend will leave me, or if I do this will happen. And so
Mm.
I'm catching myself in these patterns. And of course, like chaotically bringing it up in therapy with all the other things going on, right? But it's important that not only like I love the way you phrased it, like you're hyper vigilant of
Mhm.
others, but not yourself. And I'm working on that
Yeah.
transition. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
how can I be more aware of myself and how I'm reacting and how my responses are, and are they healthy or not? And if not, how can we change that?
Mhm. Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
work in progress.
We're all works in progress, so that's okay.
Yes. And, I wanted to like end my story with a tidbit. Like, as I was
Mm.
writing my story, preparing it to share with you, I was reflecting on why would someone share these qualities, the narcissistic traits and qualities. And I love that you kind of brought
Mm.
the discussion of needs for control, right?
Yeah.
And thinking about my parents and their emotional trauma that they face, leaving their loved ones, maybe like their entire family even, and maybe a
Yeah.
successful career behind to immigrate,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And that's like their protective measure and trait. Like, okay, if I lost
Yeah.
control in this, so I'm going to make sure I have control over this other thing.
Yeah.
And then that kind of goes into overdrive. And it's
Yeah.
like almost like
Fear.
you're in this survival mode, fear of loss of
Yeah.
control. Yeah. And then,
Yeah, and fear of unknown, fear of just,
mm-hmm.
like, anything of, like sometimes I feel like when you love somebody or, like, you care about somebody and, like, particularly, like, in a kid format, right? If you're looking at a
Yeah.
kid, I imagine again, we talk about us not being parents, but, like, I imagine, like, if you have a little kid that you're in charge of, like, if
Yeah.
you genuinely, like, love and care about this kid and, like, it's just different, like, that kind of
Yeah.
fear that you have, this, like, need to protect, and I think that sometimes when we are in such a fearful place, new world, new culture, new, like language, even new people, new experiences, whatever, you have so much abundant fear.
Yeah.
And when you have so much fear, the only thing that you can do to feel power is to control things.
Mm-hmm. So
And
what
I
we're
think,
saying is that
mhm,
narcissism is a trauma response. And then there's more trauma responses to narcissism.
trauma
And then
response.
it's
Yeah.
just a chain reaction. And we're looking at trauma
Yeah.
response inception.
Absolutely. And again, like I do take this with a grain of salt of like
Yeah.
I feel like our experiences are pretty similar to a lot of people's experiences and
Yeah.
but it's also going to be different from other people's experiences, right? Like there can
Mm-hmm.
be people like parents who actually have like a diagnosis on the other end of the spectrum and like for them there's more to it than, oh, it's about control, it's about fear. No, they genuinely might believe their needs are more important, they are superior to other people. But like we're talking about other people on the spectrum who are not on that end, who are on the
Yeah.
other end of that spectrum, who have some tendencies, some qualities, but are rare, don't come out often. Maybe they're situational.
Yeah.
Maybe they're only with certain people. We're talking about for those people, then yeah, it's maybe just a survival coping mechanism in
Yeah.
order to feel some sense of power.
Yeah. Interesting.
Mm,
I love that, we place importance on understanding or trying to brainstorm and understand why these
yeah.
qualities persist in households. And I think it really helps in the healing process because it helps remove blame and from yourself
Yeah,
and guilt and shame.
absolutely. And I've always liked that about us in our conversations is like we talk about a lot of things, on and off this
Yeah.
podcast. And like
Yeah.
some of it is like really heavy, but we're never about like trying to blame or like we're never about
Mm-hmm.
trying to like well, this is why, and like, this is why I'm going to be this way. It's always more
Yeah.
like, I love that we both come at these conversations from like such a curious place. Cause I think honestly, like that's where it's at. When we can be
Yeah.
curious, when we can stop placing blame, we can start to heal. And
Mm-hmm.
like, you know, maybe not everyone's in that place, but I agree. I kind of like that that's what we focus on.
Yep. Curiosity can lead to healing.
Mm-hmm. I love
Yep.
it.
Well, that's my story.
All right.
Yeah. Should we
All
wrap it
right. Well,
up?
thank you for sharing. I
Yep.
know that, you know, knowing you, like I was familiar with a little bit of your story, but like I always like hearing our story like on this podcast because I feel like I always find out a little something new about you.
Mm-hmm. I would say the same
And
thing.
also, I'm very proud of you because I know firsthand that this is something you like struggle with, and like, you know, that not being so hyper vigilant on like, okay, that fear of
Yeah.
abandonment, like trying to bring it back to you, and like that people pleasing, you know, recovering.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I know how
Recovering
hard you
people
work at
pleaser.
it.
Yeah.
Exactly. I know how hard you work at it. So I'm so proud of you, and
Thanks.
little
Thank you.
encouragement, like keep going. I love you so much.
Woohoo.
You got
Love
this.
you. Thanks.
All right. You want to wrap
All
up?
right. Yes. So thank you to all for tuning in. We would love to hear your feedback, any thoughts, any stories that you would like to share with us. We would love to hear that. You could reach us at our email, talksouthasiantome@gmail.com, or any of our socials, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Our handle is at talksouthasiantome.
All
Okay.
right. Until next
Bye.
time. Bye.
Bye.